Welcome to the Only Human podcast, a platform for understanding what makes us human during a pandemic, through a transition and after a crisis.
In this episode, we hear from Rebone Masemola about the emergence of future shadow pandemics that result from existing inequalities. Rebone is a content creator, strategist, anthropologist, and activist. Her interest lies in intersectional issues around sexuality, race, and class.
I read this quote recently on a legislation by the United Nations where they were speaking about the relationship between gender blind versus gender neutral policy. And then it said, gender blind action is not necessarily gender neutral impact, which is to say there is a wide gap between intent versus reality. That although gender neutral policies don't intend to be discriminatory in nature, the reality is that there are existing inequalities that fail to be addressed when there isn't a targeted approach that redresses existing social injustices. Most government policies and programs in general are put in place in a way that assumes they would be applied equally to both men and women. And then there's a further assumption that they will affect both men and women in the same way. They're assuming that both genders are starting from the same position of privilege, if you will. But we all know that this is not true. So it was unfortunate to see the same approach to policy being taken when it comes to how we're dealing with the pandemic at the moment, with our government and a lot of other international governments opting for policies and legislations that are not targeted. So by doing this, they're unintentionally aiding to existing unfair redistribution of resources. This gender neutral approach to how we tackle the pandemic does not take into account the material impact and potential role of women versus men in society and the role we each play in the economy and their particular disproportionate constraints and needs. The reality is that such gender neutral policies don't often affect men and women equally because we obviously have existing inequalities within society. They tend to be biased against women who are already starting from a disproportionate place of social and economic injustice. So in essence, they're unintentionally contributing to the continued, legislations that, are biased towards women, which means that the pandemic will affect women badly in the long term, even long after the pandemic is under control. It's my opinion, I believe that, it's vital to acknowledge the need for a differentiated approach in the context of a country especially, that we all know has been carried on the backs of Black and brown women who often single-handedly run households by themselves, because we have a problem of, single parent households in this country. We've been having this problem for years. And also the same women who are having to navigate the challenges of employment when it comes to, earning a living wage that is equal to the same amount of money that, their male counterparts get paid. They're also trying to stay safe in this country where we know that, gender-based violence is a very real problem, alongside, obviously, at the moment, the health crisis. This is to say that, nuance should matter when it comes to a pandemic that is disrupting people's primary needs and how we move and how we exist as a people. Thus, the gender-blind implementation can create a shadow crisis that can take us back as a society when it comes to the efforts we've already made to address gender inequality locally and across the world. We've seen that in the interest of public health, women and subsequently girls will be further left behind as more funding for different programs that was meant to address gender inequality is diverted to the pandemic. The reality is that it's such a false narrative to have people insist that COVID-19 is an equalizer, because it isn't. Not everyone is being affected equally. So in my case, I also remember vividly in South Africa when President Ramaphosa announced that South Africa was going under lockdown in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The moment he announced that they'll be deploying the military across the country to help subsidize the South African police service to enforce the new protective or guidelines that are supposed to protect us when it comes to curbing the surge of the virus. And many women on my timeline, including myself, and women across the country, rightfully begin to wonder and worry about their safety. We are all too familiar with the conduct of military brigades across the world who often use sexual violence as a weapon of war, who often misuse their power by taking advantage of already vulnerable groups in areas where they're deployed. Women here too feared the same outcome, even though the role of the military here was to support the police, because the military already have a bad reputation across the world. These women echoed a sense of a shared fear about the prospects that their safety may be compromised by the military, especially in a country that was already struggling with a history and a current culture of gendered violence, which in this case has become already a kind of epidemic on its own. The reality was the state didn't make any concessions to alleviate women's fears, nor offer us more institutional support that ensured that we didn't get exploited during this pandemic. They simply employed the same rules for all people when our roles and our needs were not the same. We were suddenly put in a position where we had to deal with the prospect of intersecting pandemics. This is the COVID-19 pandemic alongside, the skirt of gender-based violence. Women and girls who already form part of marginalized communities, had this exacerbated sense of fear that, they were now having to deal with multiple pandemics at the same time. Even the World Bank has cautioned that, we are to learn from previous epidemics such as HIV and AIDS, SARS, H1N1, and the Ebola crisis, which have shown that most vulnerable, be they countries, be communities, be households, be individuals, often bear the heaviest brunt or the burden of epidemics or pandemics in this case. That pre-existing gender gaps may intensify the adverse effects of COVID-19. In fact, there's a high risk that gender inequalities will widen during and after the epidemic or this pandemic, and that gains in women and girls' accumulation of human capital, education, especially in the cases where, some young girls will be forced to drop out of school to help supplement domestic care in households. Also, cases of economic empowerment will go down, disrupted support for things like access to sanitary care, structural power, gendered violence facilities also will be disrupted as people go into lockdowns. And also just in the case of voice and agency, are we seeing the presence of women and girls being represented as conversations and implementations and policies are put in place to try and fight the pandemic? There's going to be a reverse, of the gains that we've already gained in the last 10, 20 years. So in this case, we're seeing the impact affect women in two ways that I want to focus on. One is the shadow pandemic. Like in many parts of the world, we're seeing a surge in what the United Nations has called a shadow pandemic of gender-based violence across the world. With the obvious need to impose a lockdown, there was no real material or tangible consideration for how this confinement would affect women and girls living with their abuses already. The virus has created a perfect storm, if you will, during a pandemic that is impacting both the health, the safety, and the financial security of many women across the world. Even with civil society groups and gender-based violence advocacy organizations and social justice groups have also said they've recorded a lot more demand or cases for emergency shelters for women since a lot of countries have gone into lockdown. here in South Africa specifically, a lady named Rena van der Berg, who works at an organization called Grace Help Center, which deals with, it's mostly a shelter for abused women and children in Rustenburg, where she was speaking about the fact that just in the first month alone, they received a higher number of calls and reports from police which are related to gender-based violence. And this was obviously linked to lockdowns, because now suddenly children are no longer going to schools and couples are forced to spend more time together in confined spaces, which obviously created or increased frustrations, which resulted in domestic violence in some cases. And this is definitely obviously like a worrying trend that we all need to be worried about. And I think the tragedy for us is that there were no concessions in place in South Africa, considering that we already had this problem before the pandemic. The president, Cyril Ramaphosa himself, previously promised to invest billions of his state budget to tackle the ongoing surge of violence against women's bodies and, women's safety in the country. Especially last year, I think it was last year, August, when a young woman was brutally murdered, raped, and then dumped during Women's Month in this country. But sadly, this has yet to materialize, with the fear being that those budgets will now be going to the pandemic, given the perception that women's lives are dispensable, because the state was quick to implement plans for the pandemic, but there has been no political will to deal with the violence against women's bodies in this country. Things like home isolation orders obviously present abuses with increased opportunity to inflict harm on victims who, are rendered more vulnerable because they don't have support. They have reduced support during lockdowns in terms of networks, in terms of family support, in terms of limited options for escape when it comes to where they can go, because a lot of NGOs also have lost financial support, which means, they're limited in terms of the number of people that they can take in. And this also affects children in those cases. So a lot of questions being, how will women and children's safety be ensured going forward as the crisis continues? Are we putting any more measures in place when it comes to having, a lot more police presence that is responsive, but also doesn't add secondary victimization to women who are already affected by gendered violence? And one thing that's really scary is that even with recent reports from the police commissioner and the police ministers as well in this country, they've spoken about the fact that we've seen the lockdown create or add a little bit more to underreporting. There was already, a problem or crisis in this country where a lot less women are likely to report cases of violence, because where are they going to go? They're just afraid. They have nowhere to go. The World Bank also spoke about it recently when they were urging against this concern that the shift of public resources towards public health emergency poses the risk to such other, invaluable services like, NGOs that help women and girls who find themselves caught in situations of violence. And the other second issue that will affect women is the systemic issues of financial security that already women are faced with, meanwhile also propagating increased in unequal distribution of care work between men and women within households, while many of us are working from home. That it's just like a widely known problem that this country obviously is mainly dealing with a crisis of, single parent households where women tend to be the main social providers. But in the cases where you have two partners, especially in the case of heterosexual relationships, women are now bearing the brunt of most of the domestic work. And this is becoming a problem, right? Because there's no shared equal labor between men and women. Women are now having to work from home and then having to school their children, but then still being expected to deliver the same amount of work to their employers, while they navigate all of these other challenges. And I think the scary reality is that many of these women will potentially leave their employment because they are feeling so much domestic pressure to look after their kids, to look after their husbands, or to look after their partners, that they would rather risk their careers instead of like trying to manage and juggle these all of these roles, because there are no systems in place to help support many of them. And also, one of the other injustice and inequality that we saw in this country has been that even with the implementation of lockdowns, many of these women lost their jobs because they work in the informal sector. It's the go-go's that sell on the side of the road who are not allowed to sell because they sell hot food, which means you see three generations of people who live in the same household losing their income. And many of these women don't even have the security of applying for a UIF intervention because they're living from hand to mouth. This is going to have adverse effects in terms of the future of financial security for many of these women. And if these women are affected, means young girls are also affected. So a lot of them are going to drop out of school to one, help in terms of domestic care, but also a lot of them are going to have the pressure to then go looking for work to help support their households while they try to recover after the pandemic. It is a critical issue that should be addressed, because we can't just have a blanket approach when we know that not everyone is coming into this pandemic from the same position. Not everyone is already equal. So we can't just throw in untargeted approaches that don't deal with existing inequalities. So these gender blind policies could unintentionally mainly benefit privileged groups who are already favored by existing systems and institutions. And then you have women and girls who are left on the sidelines, and this will create future shadow pandemics that I don't think any of us want to see into the future.
If you wish to explore the topic of gender further, we recommend works by Laila Abulugard, Marilyn Strathern, and Sherry Ortner.
If you would like to participate in this series or ask our speakers any questions, you can reach out to us through our website, www.omniology.co.za, or on our social media @omniology_ZA.